Okay, in this lesson we're going to go through a fairly lengthy discussion on the process of selecting and manipulating objects inside of Maya. Alright, so for this lesson we're going to start with existing scene file, so let's go to Open and let's grab the scene file for Lesson 7. There we are. Now this is pretty much the same scene file that we were working with in our previous lesson, but we're going to use this as an example for moving and starting to manipulate our objects. So our discussion for the time being is going to really focus along these tools that are on this left-hand side of your interface. So these tools have keyboard shortcuts, so this is where we're going to get into our selection tools, our move tool, rotate, and our scale tool. Now the keyboard shortcuts for these correspond to really that top row of alpha keys on your keyboard. So this is going to be Q, W, E, R, T, and Y. Okay, so the Q key on your keyboard is going to be this select tool. So really, just like the name suggests, our select tool is pretty much just for making selections. So this allows us to come in here and grab our objects without any fear or any concern about accidentally moving them or accidentally manipulating them out of the way. Now the next keyboard shortcut is going to be W. W is for your move tool. Now you notice something has happened here where we've gone from the Q key down to the W key, and we've skipped a couple of these tools in between. So we'll come back to these guys a little bit later. So the W key, as I mentioned, is going to be your move tool. Again, like the name suggests, this is what is going to allow us to come in and actually grab objects and move those around. As I get into the move tool, you'll notice that we have these three little arrows that we have. These correspond to the different axes that we have in our 3D space. So this green arrow pointing up, that corresponds to the direction of our y-axis pointing upward. We have this blue z-axis pointing forward, and the red x-axis that points off to the side. Now to grab and move this object along any of these axes is just as simple as grabbing that axis indicator and moving it along that direction. Now the next keyboard shortcut that we have is the E key. The E key is our rotate tool. So as we switch into our rotate tool, this is where we can start to once again grab any of these different rings to rotate our object along any of these three axes. We also have sort of this outer light blue ring. It's a little bit difficult to see, but it's really sort of this outermost blue ring, and this allows us to sort of rotate our object in screen space instead of rotating it along any one of these three axes. Now below this we have the scale tool, which is going to be the R key on your keyboard. And again, this scale tool is what allows us to squish or flatten our objects along any one of these axes. Now with any of these three tools, the move, rotate, or scale, we can control and move our object along multiple axes at the same time. So if I switch to something like my move tool, you can see again we can grab any one of these three axes and move that object in that direction. We can also move along multiple axes at the same time. So if I grab right here in the middle of this manipulator and pick this object up and move it, we're actually moving this freely in all three axes at the same time. You can actually watch this if you take a look at the Translate X, Y, and Z over here in my channel box, which we'll talk about this here in just a little bit. You can see as I grab this object and move it, you can watch these different values actually change as I'm moving this. So again, moving that in all three axes. Now this may be something that you want. It may not always be a good idea to do this though, because while we do have the freedom of moving in three axes, we don't really have a lot of control over exactly where this object is going to wind up. So let's say we had the sphere and we wanted this to be positioned sort of back in the corner of this plane. Well, by simply just picking it up and moving it, we're really just sort of moving it in screen space. We really don't have any control over exactly where that is going to wind up. So to get around this, we could actually move in only two axes at the same time. So again, let's say I wanted this object to be able to move freely along this X and the Z axis, but I don't want it to move up or down. Well, to do that, we can simply grab the axis that we don't want it to move along. In this case, it's going to be the y-axis, and control click and drag. And now you can see it's going to move this object freely in the other two axes, in this case, the x and the z-axis. So, really nice way of giving us just a little bit of extra control over the movement and the positioning of our objects. Now we can go through this exact same procedure with some of the other tools. For example, something like the scale tool. We can scale it in one axis at a time. We could grab it right in the middle and scale this object in all three axes at the same time. Or we can control click on one of the axes to scale this object in only two axes simultaneously. Now these different tools do have options associated with them. So for example, let's say I have this little sphere that is sort of scaled. It's now been reoriented a little bit, so that way it's sort of pointing off in this different direction. Now let's say I wanted to grab this object and move it along this new direction. Well, if I switch over to my move tool, you notice that the axis indicators still point straight up, straight forward, and straight to the side. This is what's called a world orientation. So these three axes always stay locked to this world axis indicator, which we can see down in the lower corner. We can see the world direction pointing up, the world x axis, and the world z axis down here. As we move around, you can see those object or those axis indicators are moving and changing. Now we do have the ability to actually move this object along its orientation. It's just sort of a hidden option at the moment. So to access the options for any of these different tools, just simply double click on the button. There we go, and that will pull open this tool settings window, which we could leave here, or we could pick it up and move it over into something like this channel box area, so that way it shows up over on this side of the screen. So this is where we can start to get into areas like changing the orientation. Right now it's set to world, which again keeps these axis indicators locked to the world axis. We could switch this to something like the object axis. In that case, you can see these axis indicators now change to match the orientation of our object. So now we can grab this little sphere and move it exactly along that new direction that it's been rotated. And we can do the same for some of these other tools. Something like the rotate tool, for example. Now if we click on this, you can see by default it's actually set to the local space. So you can see as I move this object around that these little rotation rings will move along with the object. But if I set this to something like world, you can see now these rings always stay oriented to the world axes. And now as I start to move and rotate that object around, the rings no longer move with that object. Now, a slightly easier way of getting to these different options, instead of double-clicking on these buttons, what we can do is use the keyboard shortcut and get to these options directly within the user interface. So let's say I go back to my Move tool again, tap the W key on my keyboard, and I can get to the same options that we have over here by pressing and holding the W key on my keyboard, and then left-clicking on this object, and we get this little context menu that pops up. So this is where we can start to enable things like object orientation, which we now have enabled, or we could choose something like world orientation. You can see now it immediately snaps those axis manipulators back. You can see it's also changed this to world. So exact same settings that we have, just in this little interactive menu. Now up to this point we've been working with the objects just purely in an object mode. But any sort of an object or any piece of geometry that we create inside of Maya has what are called components. And we'll talk a lot more about components as we start to get into the modeling section of this training. But for now, what I want to show you is components and sort of the relation to these different selection methods. So to get to any sort of an object component, so what we do is just simply right-click on the geometry, press and hold the right mouse button on your keyboard, and again we get this little context menu that pops up. So this is where we can start to get to the different components that make up this surface. So let's say I jump to something like the vertex selection. There we go. You can see now my wireframe turns to sort of this little blue color, and I have these little pink vertices that are right in the middle, and I can grab these little vertices and start to move those around. We can also right-click and go to something like Face Selection, where I can grab these different faces and move those around as well. Now, this is where some of these different selection modes can come in fairly handy. So, for example, something like this Lasso Select. If I were to go to my Vertex selection, this will be maybe a little bit easier to see over here in this perspective view. So right now it can sometimes be a little bit tricky whenever you're trying to select certain components to get in here and just select the components that you want. You can press and hold the Shift key on your keyboard, or Control Shift, or just simply Control to select or deselect objects or components. But sometimes this can be a little bit tricky. So we can use something like our Lasso Select to make slightly more complex selections. This might be a little bit easier if I jump to something like my side view here. Again, just tapping on my spacebar to jump between these different views. So with the Lasso Select, we can come in here and let's say grab just a few different components here, and I'll make sort of a nice irregular selection around these. And you can see it's only going to select the components that fall inside of that marquee, so I can start to make some, again, really complex selections and not have to worry about accidentally grabbing something that I don't want. There we are. Very nice. And at this point now you can just simply jump back to your Move tool and start to grab those components and move those around. Now, another option that we have, or another tool that we have, is called this Paint Selection. Now, the paint selection comes in really handy, again, whenever you're making some fairly complex component selections, or if you want to get a little bit more detailed. So again, if I were to come in here and let's say I want to grab maybe just these components right here in front. Well, if I were to do just a normal marquee selection around these, I have a little bit of a problem. Now let me just press the 5 key on my keyboard to jump to a shaded view, so it makes it a little bit easier for you to see. So with the marquee selection, yes, I do have these vertices selected now, but the problem is, if you recall from one of the earlier lessons, if we do a marquee selection, Maya will select anything that falls in this area. So not only do I have these components selected, but if I orbit around to the back, you can see I also have some components selected behind here. Now I may not always want that. And that's always something that we need to be very careful of anytime we start to work with components. Now this paint selection tool makes this a little bit easier. So with the paint selection, let me first just maybe start by deselecting everything. Just click somewhere out here to deselect. There we go. Go back to my paint selection. And what I can do is just simply click and drag, select all of these different components, and with the paint selection, it will only grab the components that are currently visible to the camera. So if I orbit around to the back, I don't have to worry about any of these components back behind here being accidentally selected. So with this paint selection, I don't have to press and hold the Shift key to add to my selection. I just simply continue to click and drag, and this paint selection will continue to add these different components to my selection. If I want to deselect, just press and hold the Control key as I start to drag, and that will remove objects from this area of selection. Now if I want to control or change this area that my selection is being made, you can see I have this big red ring, and it's going to select any objects that fall inside of that ring. To change that ring radius, just press and hold the B key on my keyboard. Just remember B for brush, since we're using a paint selection. Press and hold the B key on my keyboard. Click and drag my mouse, or my left mouse button, from side to side, and I can change the area or the size of that ring. So now I can get in here a little bit more detailed and start to paint or deselect certain areas. And this paint selection works with really any component mode. So if I right click and go to face selection, you can see I can come in here and start to paint faces. Again, press and hold the Control key if I want to deselect. So really nice features that we have here as far as being able to paint and make some fairly complex selections. Now let's talk a little bit about this next tool down here, which is the Soft Modification tool. The Soft Modification tool is really one that we can use for making component selections or making object selections where, let's say we grab one component and we start to move it, but we don't necessarily want just that one component to move. Maybe we want something that gives us a little bit more of an organic look, where we can actually grab a component and start to move it, and maybe have it influence some of these components all around it. Well, that's exactly what this soft modification tool does. Now, the soft modification tool is a little bit older feature. It's been around for quite a while. And I actually have sort of gotten away from using this because there is a little bit newer, a little bit more streamlined feature inside of Maya that does the exact same thing as the soft modification tool, but you don't necessarily have to switch to this tool. So what I'm talking about is called the soft select feature. Now this is found anytime we use the move, scale, or rotate tools. So if I grab the move tool and then quickly tap the B key on my keyboard, you can see that everything all of a sudden looks very, very different. So we get this sort of a yellow area, and then it sort of starts to change color to sort of this dark orange. Now what's going to happen here is if I start to grab one of these components, you notice even though I just have this one component selected, it's sort of grabbing and warping everything on this object. So with this soft select tool, if I double click on this move tool, scroll down, what I'm actually turning on is this feature right here, soft select. So again, tapping the B key on my keyboard is what's toggling this on and off. Again, just like with my paint select tool, if I want to change this area, just press and hold the B key, click and drag, and you can see I can start to dial down that little ring of influence. So now as I start to bring that ring down, it's only going to affect the components that fall inside of this ring. So now if I grab that vertex and move it, you can see it's slightly moving these vertices or whatever components we have selected around it. Okay, so that's actually really, really nice for modeling purposes. And again, if we ever need to get out of this mode, just quickly tap the B key, and now we're back to normal components. Now, anytime we want to get back to the point where we're just manipulating the object by itself, not the individual components, all we need to do is right-click on this object and then go up to Object Mode. You can see now our wireframe turns back to this green color, which means we're now working with the surface itself instead of the individual components that make this surface up. I'm going to press Ctrl-A on my keyboard to jump back and forth between this channel box and this attribute editor. We'll talk again a lot more about the attribute editor and the channel box as we start to get into some of the later lessons in this course. But for now, the last thing that I want to show you is this Show Manipulators tool. So if I grab something like this NURBS sphere over here and jump over to this Show Manipulators tool, you notice really not a whole lot happens, really nothing to see here. And that's because this Show Manipulators tool really doesn't necessarily work on the object itself. Instead, it works on some sort of an input that can be created either by doing modeling adjustments, doing some deformation adjustments. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about some of these different topics in some of the later lessons, but for now I just want you to see sort of what this Show Manipulators tool is able to do. So if I select this Show Manipulators tool, select an object, and then go into the channel box, again just making sure that we have our channel box selected, scroll down and let's go to this input for Make NURBS Sphere. Now as soon as we select this over here, you'll notice that all of a sudden we start to get some manipulators that show up with this Show Manipulators tool. So now we can start to control things like the aim of this sphere. You can see it's keeping the same scaling and modification adjustments, but now we're just sort of tweaking and rotating that object and sort of changing its orientation. We can actually grab this object itself and maybe rotate it from a different point, or we could grab it sort of right here in the middle and move them both at the same time. Also, if you take a look, we have this little outer ring around this particular object. If we grab that outer ring, we can start to come in here and adjust things like the spread of that. So if we actually wanted this to seem a little bit more peeled open, we could do that. And again, this is done with the Show Manipulators tool, and depending on what sort of inputs you have selective or have available here, you can start to get different sets of manipulators and things like that. But primarily, you're just going to find yourself using these rows of buttons sort of right up here, everything from the Select tool down to the scale tool. These guys down here become sort of special use tools and probably won't be used just a whole awful lot. So that's a quick look, or rather a fairly lengthy look, I should say, at some of these different selection tools and some of the different settings that we have available within these different QWERTY keyboard shortcuts.